for carving out some time from your busy schedule to be here this evening. I wanted to begin, of course, the person you thank will steps out of the room when you're ready to thank him, but I wanted to thank Rabbi Freundlich, as well as Congregation Beth Jacob, for helping put this shir together, for publicizing it, and for giving me the platform with which to share some ideas that are, I believe, very much germane to the period of time that we are now in, the 3 weeks. Now, I will tell you that I believe that the topic that I selected for tonight is ambitious, and in some ways maybe even borderline arrogant. And I say that because, we're talking about a topic that has in many ways perplexed our people for a long time. We're talking about an issue that many, many people, far greater than myself or anyone in this room, with all due respect to everybody present, have grappled with into understanding what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us, and how it is that we can make the most appropriate use of the period of time that we are now in. The 3 weeks is a period of time of mourning, more so for Ashkenazim in many ways even than Sephardim. I'm not going to get into that conversation right now, but certainly beginning with the period of the breaching of the walls of Yerushalayim and moving forward, which ultimately culminated in the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, we know that this is a difficult time. It's the most tragic time of the Jewish calendar, and there are certain things that we do that we abstain from in order to mark that mourning in a more pronounced type of way. So you have in front of you, it's a little bit faint, but hopefully you can follow along with me. It's all in Hebrew, but I will translate. I guarantee to you, everybody will be able to get that translation and will be able to follow along. So I thought we would begin by understanding what it is that we're mourning about, because obviously that's the most important context. What occurred, and based on what occurred, how can we then approach it? So let's begin with the Mishnah in Tammuz, which lists 5 tragic occurrences that took place on the 17th of Tammuz, as well as those occurrences, the 5 that took place on the 9th of Av. Chamisha devarim iru es avosenu b'shiva asar b'Tammuz, v'chamisha b'tisha b'av. 5 occurred on each date. B'shiva asar b'Tammuz nishtabu haluchos. On the 17th of Tammuz, the first set of tablets, the Decalogue, the stones that Moshe Rabbeinu had received, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had carved it himself, exactly what that means, and Moshe was prepared to bring those luchos down from Har Sinai to Klal Yisrael, and was confronted with the incident of the egel, whether he actively dropped them, forcibly dropped them, if you will, or just couldn't sustain the weight any longer because of the shock. Whatever the explanation is, Moshe Rabbeinu, the luchos were broken. That occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. So that, of course, was the outgrowth of the golden calf, of the Chet Egel. Second incident that the Mishnah tells us, Ubitel HaTamid. The carbon tamid, the daily sacrifice that we read about when we read the Karbanos in the morning, had been in play for hundreds of years, and towards the very end, when the circumstance in Yerushalayim had become particularly acute, when the fighting became very, very strong, the siege had really taken hold, they were no longer able to sustain the offering any longer, and the tamid was mevutal, it became terminated, so to speak. The Hufka ha'ir, and the ear, the city, was breached. Now, it doesn't say that it occurred twice, as it will say for the Batei Mikdash, and so that leads into the opinion that this date is only the date of Bayis Sheni, whereas for Bayis Rishon it occurred on Tes Tammuz, a little bit earlier, but because of the closer proximity, so to speak, of Bayis Sheni to us than Bayis Rishon, we commemorate Shiva Asar b'Tammuz. Also, I would think, because of the other instances or incidents that we've already mentioned. The Saraf Apostamos Torah, a certain Greek general by the name of Apostamos, burned a Torah, and we also know that an idol was erected in the Heichal, in the area of the Beis HaMikdash, and for those 5 reasons, we commemorate the 17th of Tammuz as a day of fast, as a day of mourning, as a day of extra tefillah. Of course, we're doing that right now. The Mishnah continues to talk about Tisha B'Av, coming in 3 weeks. The first thing that the Mishnah lists for us on Tisha B'Av is the decree that HaKadosh Baruch Hu passed, the edict that the Jewish people would not enter into the land, and that was the direct result of the incident of the spies of the Meraglim. When the 12 Meraglim returned, 10 of which brought a libelous depiction, if you will, of Eretz Yisrael, and said that we were unable to capture the land. There was no way that we were going to be victorious. Klal Yisrael went along with that presentation, broke into crying, into mourning, etc. And we're going to read a Gemara that describes that more in detail shortly. That was the first incident. The second one, the Charav Habayis Barishona Ubashnia. Both Batei Mikdash were destroyed on the 9th of Av. You should know historically that's a true statement, but to be clear, it began on the 9th of Av, towards the end of the day, and continued on to the 10th of Av, which is why we continue to mourn on to the 10th of Av as well. You're familiar probably with the fact that we don't eat meat, drink wine, do other things, cut our hair until midday of the 10th of Av, unless we have a situation of a nidcha where we actually commemorate Tisha B'Av on the 10th of Av because Tisha falls out on Shabbos. Then the 11th of Av, so to speak, we don't do anything. But the 10th of Av is a day of mourning as well because it was when the Beis HaMikdash, when the Churban began, that's when we commemorate, because that's when it's freshest in our mind. If you could lahavdil, imagine for a moment with the imagery that you first took into your mind of 9/11, the first time you saw an image of a plane smashing into one of the towers and the flame that erupted. So all the subsequent burning that occurred afterwards, even though it burned for an extensive period of time afterwards, that wasn't the trauma. The real trauma was what took place at the beginning, when we saw that, and of course when the buildings collapsed as well. The fourth incident, because that was two, was V'nochida Beta. You might be familiar with an individual by the name of Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba lived, he was most active around the years 132 to 135 of the Common Era, about 65 years after the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. He was active during the period of the Emperor Hadrian, who was a terrible enemy of the Jewish people, many negative decrees that compromised core Jewish living. And so Bar Kokhba led a revolt and was initially successful, much like, parenthetically, the Jews at the time of the Great Revolt of 66 were initially successful and were able to declare independence and minted their own coins and form their own government. It wasn't long-lasting, and slowly but surely the Romans advanced and eventually took the city, but we find that there as well. So Beitar, which was the last bastion, the last stronghold of Bar Kokhba and his forces, fell on the 9th of Av. That's what the Gemara tells us. V'nechor Shaha'ir, and the city was plowed over. The city was plowed over, one of, I believe, by Hadrian as well, one of his ways by which to demonstrate that it was over. There's no going back. There's no aspirations for rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. He winds up renaming the city and attributing it to a Roman god, Aelia Capitolina, different conversation. So therefore, we have 5 instances, 5 events, tragic events that took place on the 17th of Tammuz, 5 more that took place on the 9th of Av, and for those reasons we commemorate each of them as days of mourning. And it concludes by saying Mishanichnas of Mema'atin B'Simcha. When the 9th of Av arrives, when the month of arrives, we diminish in our joy. Parenthetically, I will mention that Rav Dessler says that the same way by which we diminish our joy systematically throughout the beginning of the month of Av, so we have what we call Shavuot, we have from Rosh Chodesh, and then we have Shavuot Shechalba, which is the week in which Tisha B'Av occurs, and then we have Erev Tisha B'Av, and then we have the night of Tisha B'Av, and then it kind of like between that until Chatzos, that's the climax, and slowly restore certain things after that. The month of Adar, which is Misha Nichnas Adar Marvin B'Simcha, he said should also follow a similar but reverse tag. So it's an interesting idea. We don't do it in a structured way, the way that we do in the month of Av, but the notion that we just show up on Purim and we should be B'Simcha, Odessa says it's an avoda, and you have to work towards that. Okay, so now let's take a look at number 2 on your list. Now, I do want to point out, actually, before we get into that, it's important to realize that we view Jewish history, we view life in general, but certainly Jewish history is not coincidental. We view that if there are specific things that seem to keep coming back to particular dates over and over, obviously there's a core message. So I often talk about an image that I have in my mind that I believe I got from our vessel, but I'm not sure. But if you can imagine for a moment a supersized coil, or the children in the room can think of a slinky. And imagine if we took it, instead of bounding it down the steps, as you often used to see in the commercials, imagine if you could take it and you could extend it. And you could extend it in a perfect vertical line from the floor to the ceiling. So everybody in your own mind, your own way, can be imagining